Hello and welcome to this edition of Atlantic Council Front Page, or hashtag AC Front Page, our premier live ideas platform for global leaders, all in the service of the Atlantic Council mission of shaping the global future alongside friends and allies. We've hosted heads of state and government from Singapore to Colombia and from Kenya to Afghanistan and places beyond and in between, as we track the impact of COVID-19 and the worldwide economic downturn. We've hosted the Secretary General of NATO, the Executive Director of the IMF, the sitting Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, as the US confronts perhaps the most significant election of our lifetimes. Today, we welcome Daniel Yergin, Pulitzer Prize winning author and world-renowned energy expert, on the occasion of the publication of his newest book, The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. I'm Fred Kempe. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I've known Dan and admired his work, going back to many years from today, to my time at the Wall Street Journal. My biggest compliment to people who are great experts is I've been stealing his ideas for years, and that's true in this case. I'm hugely looking forward to this interaction, as are our listeners across myriad platforms and around the world. I'll weave your questions among my own, which you can pose in the Q&A function of Zoom, or send through Twitter at hashtag AC Front Page. Aside from everything else that Dan does, he serves as well as vice chairman. He serves primarily as vice chairman of IHS Markit, but he's also a part of the Energy Advisory Group here at the Atlantic Council, which provides guidance throughout the year to our Global Energy Center and its excellent director, Randy Bell, and his remarkable team, particular tip of the hat today to David Young, who's helped with this program. The subject at the heart of our discussion today also lies at the heart of the work of our Global Energy Center. What is the geopolitics of the energy transition? Who will be the winners? Who will be the losers? And what will influence that map most dramatically? In short, as the book title suggests, what is the new map? Best of all, Dan isn't just a historian or an energy expert. He's also a gifted writer and a wonderful storyteller. For those of you inspired by the book during this session, you can click on the link in the chat room for Politics and Prose, our favorite bookshop. It's actually the neighborhood bookshop for Dan and myself. Or you can buy it at a bookshop near you, or Amazon, of course. So Dan, before I ask you to navigate your various map sections in the book, and as you go through the book, you go to the US, China, Russia, Middle East, climate, and then make some really stark conclusions. Let's picture pulling back and looking at the whole planet. You wrote an excerpt from your book in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, where you start with the CEO of a Mideast oil company visiting you here. And instead of talking about the Middle East, he can't get over all the Teslas he's seeing in California. You write, what he saw in those electric cars was a looming transition that in the decades ahead will shift the world away from using oil, natural gas, and coal. You write, and that's what the book is about, how this transition will change the map of global power. Quote from Dan Yergin, China is poised to be the big winner. Russia and the Middle East, oil exporters, the big losers. The US is likely to fall somewhere in between. Talk to us about that. Why China the big winner? The
Sure.
Others, I guess, are okay, but talk to us particularly,
Right.
Looking at the planet, why China the
Right.
big winner?
Sure. Fred, first let me say thank you. It's an honor to be part of the front page and to congratulate the Atlantic Council on what you've done over the last 6 months in terms of becoming a great center virtually for content. And obviously the Energy Center itself is doing very important work. So I was very pleased to be able to join you. So on the subject that you asked about, I said two reasons that China is a winner. One, ever since the Korean War, China has been greatly concerned strategically about depending on imported oil. And currently it depends for oil on imports for 75% of its oil. They see that as a strategic problem. So an energy transition, electric vehicles, they can have more cars on the road, would mean importing less oil. So that's a positive for them. The other side is that they have focused on the new energies and they've carved out a major global position. 70%, roughly almost 70% of the world's solar panels come from China. Produced in other countries by Chinese companies, it's 80%. And also in batteries, lithium battery supply chain. So they've kind of positioned for an energy transition that moves away over decades, and I should say maybe many decades, from the traditional resources.
Thank you for that. And we're going to come back to China and also to other parts of the map in a minute. But let's zoom in on the United States, and I guess zoom in this period of time has a whole new connotation, but let's zoom in on the American map. Dan, I'd like to give listeners a taste for your literary bent. This is the beginning of just a remarkable chapter. Quote, "If you want to get to the beginning of the shale revolution, pick up Interstate 35E out of Dallas and head north 40 miles and then take the turnoff to the tiny town of Ponder. Past the feed store, the Whitewater Tower, the sign for the Cowboy Church, the donut store that's closed down. Another 4 miles and you're in Dish, Texas, population about 400. I won't continue, but it continues in this similar bent. But Dan, you deliver us right to the S.H. Griffin #2 natural gas well where it all began. Tell us about that spot on Earth and why you see the shale oil and shale gas revolution as the biggest energy innovation of the 21st century.
Yeah, I would say the biggest innovation so far, because really think about wind and solar. You know, people think those are new. Those are 50-year, modern wind and solar, 50-year, half-century-old industries. And it's only in the last 10 years that they've really reached maturity and costs come down. So shale has been basically a highly disruptive technology. I wanted to go and see that spot. Now it's just a little enclosed by a wire fence, but it was a result of about 18 years of stubborn perseverance, because drilling that well went against what the petroleum textbook said. But that well really was a well that in a way changed the world and started the shale revolution, which has had a much bigger impact, I think, than many people think about. Obviously, it's transformed the world oil market. It's made the U.S. the #1 oil producer in the world. Big impact on the U.S. economy, on investment, hundreds of billions of dollars of new investment in factories, manufacturing in the Midwest, balance of payments, government revenues. But it's also been, I think, had a bigger influence on foreign affairs than many people would recognize. And sometimes when I'm in other countries, when I was traveling a lot in other countries, you had a sense that other countries recognized the importance of this shale revolution more than many people do in the United States.
That's really interesting. And you actually now have the shale manufacturers in one way or another sitting down with their lawyers in OPEC, right? Now,
last April, I have this chapter called "The Plague." You know, I only finished the book in July, which is, you know, kind of a tight time frame, but describing what happened when oil prices basically went negative, below zero. And Donald Trump, who said he's always hated OPEC, became the deal maker between Saudi Arabia and Russia, putting a deal together that stabilized the market and demonstrated the world oil market today is not OPEC versus non-OPEC. It's the big three. It's the United States, Russia, and China, and how they interact with each other.
So why shouldn't then the United States, going back to my very first question, be the biggest winner? Because not only do we have all these resources, which China doesn't seem to have, but we also have the ability to innovate and go into the new energy technologies. Why would you say we're winners and losers?
Well, I think, first of all, of course, we have a very large oil and gas industry now in the United States. which is a source of current strength, as we've said. A rapid transition, which I don't actually think will happen, would diminish that value, or at least raise questions. And we can come back to what bans on fracking and things like that would be. But I think, you are kind of getting, I mean, the thing that really strikes me is this incredible innovative ecosystem that we have that stretches from the Department of Energy spending $6.5 billion under this administration on basic science, national labs, universities, research centers, companies, startups. Nobody else has that system. I mean, I was really surprised when I checked. There are like 62 projects, companies, people working on advanced nuclear systems in the United States. And, who knows which one will work. But there is that sense in the United States that a lot of different people can go down a lot of different paths and come up with disruptive technologies, whether it's in terms of shale or digitalization or, cell phones.
Thanks for that, Dan. So let's shift the map in the Q&A. People may want to come back to some of these questions. But
Fred, can I just make one point that I think is very, you did that really interesting interview with Secretary Pompeo last week.
Right.
And he has commented on the fact, which in the Obama administration, Tom Donilon also said, is just how this change of shale gives a flexibility to U.S. foreign policy and an influence and a dimension of influence that it just didn't have when the United States was importing 60% of its oil.
Could you drill down on that a little bit better? So what sort of flexibility does one have? If one can be more concrete about it, the U.S. oil leadership position, which wasn't there a few years ago, how does that change the way the U.S. how does that change the nature of U.S. global leadership?
Well, take Iran, whether it's the Obama approach to Iran, the Trump approach, or what might be a Biden approach if Biden's president. It's very different because that we're not importing 60% of our oil, and that the Iranians did not think that when Obama started the sanctions to get them to the negotiating table, they would work because they thought the world needed Iranian oil. Turned out that the world did need Iranian oil, and a big reason for that is this extraordinary, rapid, huge growth in U.S. supply going into the world market. I think that's one example. Another example we can take as an expert on this is Vladimir Putin, who sees U.S. exports of energy, particularly liquefied natural gas to Europe, eroding the position of Gazprom. And I think some in Moscow see the shale revolution really almost as an adjunct to U.S. foreign policy in terms of the flexibility that it gives. The other example that I know quite well is in terms of India. We've always had a complex relationship with India. There are other very important aspects of the relationship with India, to be sure, but this has become a very significant and a very visible aspect that the U.S. is actually exporting oil and gas to India and is working with India on its energy needs. That's something that could not have happened before, and that looms quite large for the Modi government.
Those are great examples. The freedom to do the sanctioning of Iran without fundamentally influencing the oil price, the LNG possibilities and how it could alter balances in Europe, and then the export to India. That's really good examples. Next in the book, you take us to Russia's map and then to China's map, and I'll jump a little bit back and forth between these two sections. The China section is worth the purchase of the book all alone. I just think it's just really important reading, significant reading. But here I'm going to ask our production whiz online, Jackson, to put up a wonderful photograph from the book of Putin making pancakes with President Xi. I think this is 2019, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you let me know why in a book called The New Map that you've got, and it's actually making blinis. He's teaching President Xi how to make blinis. Why you decided this? By the way, these photos are in black and white in the book. There's a great collection of photos, and then on Dan's website he has the color versions.
Well, as you can see, the two guys, these two guys who describe themselves as best friends, are cooking something up, and I think it goes beyond blinis. This was at the same time that the Russians were having the largest military exercises that had taken place in the Soviet space since the early 1980s, and the Chinese were participating. And the significance of this is that as China and Russia get closer, these two men are closer. They describe each other, as I said, as best friends. And they are, as the US relations with both become more difficult and truculent, they get together. It's a relationship that's based on strategic interests. It's based upon kind of what they would call absolute sovereignty, but both resistance to what they see as a US dominated international order. It's also based upon oil and gas. And one of the things I say in the new map is that a relationship that was once based on Marx and Lenin is significantly grounded today in oil and gas. And Russia's become a very big exporter to China, and that's part of their relationship. It's exporting gas. It's also exporting military weapons, which they didn't used to do because they were worried about reverse engineering. But as the relationship has gotten closer, they're doing that now.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really useful things about the book is, yes, you are an expert on energy, but you do understand the interconnections with all the other things you were just talking about. I've been told by energy people who've met with Putin that Putin knows more about energy and energy production than perhaps any other national leader. How do you think he sees the map for himself? He's got it's 40 to 60% of the government's budget, energy in any one year, 55 to 60% of export earnings, 30% of GDP. Senator McCain called Russia a gas station masquerading as a country. But somehow he's done okay through all this period of time, though you do forecast him potentially as being one of the losers of the energy transition. So what are his strengths and weaknesses in his position going into the energy transition?
Well, it is the heavy dependence on oil and gas. It's interesting. He gave a speech this week where he said we used to get 50% of our government revenues from oil and gas. Now we get about 30%. He said that's good because we showed resilience. But he also said government expenditures because of coronavirus are going up 23% and revenues are going down 11%. So it's a country that's still very dependent and has just had trouble diversifying its economy. But what he has done, it's remarkable. He's a very skilled judoist. He's very good at taking advantage of situations. And with an economy that's smaller than Italy's, somewhat larger than Spain, he's restored Russia as a great power, as a player in the world, in the Middle East and in many other parts of the world. But it's still a nation for which hydrocarbons are important to its overall GDP.
So let's go back to the pancake making for just a second. What is your view on the debate that rages here in Washington, but elsewhere as well, about the durability and the significance of this strategic alignment between China and Russia? It does, you were talking about their friendship, it does seem a little bit of a bromance soaked in oil and gas and weaponry. But in 2005, as you write in the book, just 5% of China's oil came from Russia. Now it's 30%, eclipsing Saudi Arabia as the major supplier. These are long-term agreements. There are pipelines involved in this. Are we seeing a fundamental coming together in a strategic sense of Russia and China, in your view?
Yeah. Well, I think we can literally go back to the idea of the map. Within the same weeks that the U.S. put sanctions, President Trump on his way to Florida signed the legislation that puts sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that runs from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea and stopping this $11 billion project 3 weeks from completion. Putin and Xi had a very elaborate ceremony where they gave, as they put it, the command to start the flow of gas through this huge pipeline called, interestingly, the Power of Siberia, sending Russian gas into China. So I think the energy side of that relationship does get stronger. After the U.S. put sanctions on Arctic development, the Chinese were allowed to invest in Russian LNG projects in the Arctic, which had not happened before. So I think that relationship gets tighter. And I was struck when I was at a conference in St. Petersburg, I guess, a year and a half ago, less. And it was Putin and Xi on the stage. And Putin apologized for Xi. He said, I kept you up talking till 4 a.m. in the morning, your time. And Xi said, that's okay. We never have enough time to talk about. And I suspect that one thing that they do talk about a fair amount is the United States.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also interesting that Russia seems to have found itself comfortable in the quote unquote junior relationship, which one never thought was going to be the case.
Yes, I think so. The other anecdote I have in the book is that last year when Putin and Xi were meeting in Central Asia, in one of the capitals, it was Xi's birthday. And so Putin, actually, I just think it's really funny. He brought him Russian ice cream, which he said was Xi's favorite flavor. And there's a little sort of packet to carry frozen things of him delivering ice cream to Xi.
Yeah, this is why the book is such a rich read. Let's zoom in with one more question on China. And again, Jackson, if you could pull up another photo. Dan, I think it's fair to say that yours is the only energy-related book in print that features a poster of Jackie Chan.
Yes.
So can you explain why you put this one in and what's the meaning of this photo to your new map for?
As you know, they say a photo's worth 10,000 words. Maybe this is worth 20,000 words. But this is a movie called Kung Fu Yoga. And it was a production about a Indian archaeologist and a Chinese archaeologist who together go and seek a buried treasure. And the classic lines in the movie is how good the cooperation and one of the characters says, well, this is in line with the Belt and Road policy. And the other archaeologist said, well said. And this is it was to convey how broad-ranging this Belt and Road strategy, this $1.4 trillion strategy of China is. There's a Belt and Road film festival meant to celebrate it. And this seemed to be a particularly vivid way to capture that. The movie's called Kung Fu Yoga. I think you can stream it.
And then what is one of the richest parts of the China section focuses, takes us back to Admiral Zheng He, also known as the Three-Jeweled Eunuch. And he was the fleet commander of the 15th century. You go everywhere from there to current territorial struggles of South China Sea. But President Xi has restored Admiral Zheng from the 15th century. Why has he done this? And what does that have to do with the map from his point of view?
Well, it's fascinating. Zheng He led these giant Chinese armadas that sailed around the world, conveying the glory of the emperor. And the ships that he had were many times larger than the ships that Columbus sailed into the United States, a century later. So it was really, it was quite remarkable. These huge treasure ships would appear on the horizon. And I think Zheng He made 6 voyages. He died on the last voyage. And then a new emperor took power. And there had been this great struggle between the eunuchs on one side and the bureaucrats on the other. And the bureaucrats prevailed. The fleets, these huge ships were all burned. Zheng He was forgotten, but he was revived really in the 21st century as the symbol of China's outwardness, its reach across the South China Sea, sailing as far as the east coast of Africa. And it's meant to convey that China's reach centuries ago and to bring it to the modern day. So he's become a very important figure.
Thank you for that. I want to get to questions as quickly as we can, but I do want to touch on the Mideast map. At another time, this sort of book would have had the Mideast map right up front. You might have started your book there at a different time. We've seen some recent news with the UAE and Bahrain deals with Israel. What does the Mideast map look like to you? And when you see a deal like the UAE with Israel and Bahrain, UAE and Bahrain both producers, is there an energy side to this? Because Israel is also looking for resources and has some of its own.
Yeah, Well, I think there is an energy side in many ways. I mean, there are many factors that were at work in making this. I think it's quite historic in a way because of the forest fires, other things that were happening. Maybe it didn't receive as much attention here, but I think it was a very historic moment, kind of looking beyond what have been the battles over 70 years. And I think there is an energy, there's obviously security dimension. I think that the drone attacks a year earlier on the big Saudi Abqaiq facility said something about vulnerability. And I think that they're looking, the Gulf countries, to the relationship with Israel from a security and technology point of view. I think there's an energy component as well. Obviously, Abu Dhabi, the UAE is a major exporter, Abu Dhabi being the largest of the Emirates. But I think there's also the sense, and this was pre-Trump, that when Obama was there, that the US would just lose interest in the region because, in fact, we're not self-sufficient, but largely self-sufficient in oil. The security situation is different. And that I think it was in the interest of the Gulf countries, one of the things was to form a stronger relationship with a very strong military regional power in terms of the confrontation with Iran, which of course looms so large for them. So I think it's, in a sense, we can say that it's partly the shale revolution that in some senses would have been one of the factors that led to that historic new relationship.
Fascinating. And again, in the questions, we may come back to the Mideast. I see a few questions coming in. Lots of questions about climate. I think I want to, let me tee this up and then pass to a board member of ours, Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State, who has got a question related to climate. But at the same time, let me tee up a couple of other questions around this that are related to this. One from Alexander Vigna, which is, what is the speed of the energy transition foreseen by Dan Yergin globally? And you do write about this, comparing it to how long it took from wood to coal and then from coal to oil. It was slower, but there may be factors that move this a little bit longer. So let me pass to Paul to ask her question, and then you can sort of talk to those two questions and also to how you write about the climate map, because you have a section on the climate map as well.
Thank you, Fred. Good morning, Dan, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
You posit that meeting the goal of net carbon zero by 2050 requires breakthroughs and innovations. Now, right now, there really is nothing in place so advanced across the range of economic activities that allows us to get to net carbon zero by 2050. So what is the extent of your confidence that there will be these dramatic technological breakthroughs that are going to materialize in time to enable us to reach this goal? And if they do not, what's your plan B?
Okay, well, my plan B, let's see. Well, the first thing, I think it's clear directionally the way things are going. I spoke recently to CEOs of the electric power industry, and I was very struck in the dialogue how many of them are focused on net zero carbon by 2035 or 2050. So directionally, it's happening. However, I think people lose sight of the scale. Today, the world gets 84% of its energies from oil, gas, and coal. I don't, it's just hard to see how, that oil and gas are going to disappear by any means. So, that's where you get into the technology question of, we did a study, I write about it in the book, and you refer to that chapter with former Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz for Bill Gates Foundation and for Breakthrough Energy Coalition, just talking about all the technologies we don't have, that don't exist to get there. So I think that's why the basic science, the research part of this is so important. You can try and solve it, move there with regulation. Europe is going to have some very strong, some might say very heavy-handed regulation, trying to rebuild their economy, their entire economy in 30 years. I think it's just going to be difficult. It's difficult. I mean, we're not in, it took 200 years to go from the first breakthrough on coal, really beyond just replacing wood, to coal being half of world energy. Clearly, we're not in the 18th century. We're not in the 19th century. We're not in the 20th century. We have amazing technologies. We're seeing the impact of digitalization and all of that. But still, it's a scale question. And the other thing that strikes me, Paula, I have this chapter about what does energy transition mean for emerging markets, for developing countries. Very different message for an India or Nigeria would say they need to have commercial energy, natural gas, to reduce indoor air pollution, which is something that afflicts about 3 billion people in the world because they cook with primitive traditional fuels. So I think it's energy transition is happening, but I think 2050 is actually, from an energy point of view, is not very far away.
Thank you.
And let me turn to International Advisory Board member Majid Jafar. And Majid, perhaps you can also, for other people on the line, say a couple of words about Crescent Petroleum and your work in this area. And I think his question will go to the new map or the potential new map in financing energy in the world. Majid.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks, Dan, for the great book. Very timely. Crescent Petroleum is the oldest private oil and gas company in the Middle East. My question, building on the energy transition discussion that you guys just had, is if we turn to the investor point of view, we've seen the dual effects of the increased awareness of climate change, as well as the fall in oil prices, harm investor returns and appetite in Western capital markets for oil and gas. And we've seen some of the majors, particularly in Europe, in the last few weeks, basically announce that they would be reducing their investments in the sector and increasing it in renewables. And yet, as you've just pointed out, Dan, the demand is still going to be there for decades to come in oil and gas. So what does that mean about who the investors are going to be? Is it going to be China or other Asian governments, increasing role for the national oil companies? And what are the implications for geopolitically?
Well, Majid, you've described what is a changing situation. And I think you pointed to the two factors that have affected investor appetite. One is the growth of ESG, environment, social governance investing, very much affected. And this ties into Paula's question, going back to the Paris agreement, the climate agreement. And, when you look at the energy world, there are two eras now, as at least it hit me when I was writing the book, before Paris and after Paris. And we're in the after Paris, and that is affecting the attitude of investors towards the sector. And I think that's part of the reason that you see, obviously, the shift of these major companies. The other thing is poor returns. You've had two price collapses since 2014, and the returns haven't been there. So I think part of what will govern what happens in the future is what happens to prices and the returning money to investors. But I think the ESG factor only seems to be growing. If it's particularly strong in Europe, it would become, we could see, if there's a Biden presidency, we could see a shift on the part of financial regulators that pushes it as well. The other side of it is that we calculate that about $4.5 trillion will be required in the upstream oil sector, $4.5 trillion over the next few years to between 2020 and 2024, simply to meet the demands of the market, to deal with depletion and so forth. You raise the question, where's that money going to come from? Is it going to come from national oil companies, or will it come from investors in other parts of the world? Will it be, go back to that picture of Belt and Road, will China be a bigger investor? Will India in due course be a bigger investor? And so, there'll be a shift, I think, in ownership within the global industry.
Thank you for that. You don't have a section, if I'm not mistaken, you don't have a section in the book on the Europe map. Andreas Macha has a question that he's written in. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. What's the position of Europe on this new map? Being an importer, will Europe just have to follow what the big players are dictating? How long will shale provide the U.S. with its current leverage? And I guess one has to get to the new technologies as well, though he doesn't raise that. So what's the Europe place on this map?
Well, I do talk about Europe. I don't, have a separate Europe map, but I talk about Europe in terms of not the Green New Deal, the Green Deal that the EU has announced. And they have what's called the taxonomy, which is meant to go back to Paula's question, to try and push as rapidly as possible to that net zero carbon. And I kind of described, I wrote a book once co-wrote a book called The Commanding Heights. And it's like the green commanding heights, because you see, in order to achieve it, quite an extension of regulatory power, quite intervention in the economy to really move it, and requiring quite a lot of money to do it. And one question I have, we hear Build Back Better. I think one question, and it goes to that and to Paula's question, is that governments are going to come out with staggering amounts of debt out of the coronavirus. What kind of resources will they have? And at the end of the book, I kind of raise the question, will we see a kind of clash between environment ministers and finance ministers? Environment ministers, to use that as a sort of a type, wanting to push rapidly towards net zero carbon. Finance ministers focused on recovery of the economy and dealing with the wounds that this crisis has left. But so that's how I deal with kind of Europe's ambitions in this area. And I think they're breathtaking, actually, what they're proposing to do.
And is COVID-19 per se going to, it accelerates a lot, we're seeing that. Is it going to accelerate the energy transition? If you look at our own stimulus in one way or another, if you look at our own stimulus money in the US, it hasn't been pushed in that direction. In Europe, some has. I don't know how much has, but what impact will COVID-19 have on that?
Well, I think, first of all, it is, how does a change work? The fact that you can convene an international meeting like this, people not traveling, many more people, Majid can join us without having to, fly 12 hours to get to Washington to be part of the conversation. And so in this section on the impact of COVID, I asked the question, to what degree will the office of the future be at home? To what degree and you see companies saying, well, maybe 25% of their people will work at home. We'll see if that works over a long period of time. On the other hand, you see an uptick in purchases of used cars, at least in the United States, because people are a little more leery about being in public transportation. But I think, there'll be those kind of changes that will come out of this kind of behavioral organizational. We'll have a kind of K, not a V or U recovery, a K recovery, with some sectors really recovering digital and others particularly concerned about small business, which is 44% of employment in private sector employment in the United States, that will, so many companies, those businesses just aren't going to come back, and those wounds will go deep. But then there's a question of Build Back Better, green investment. I scratch my head a little bit and say, well, exactly what will that mean? It means investing in charging stations for electric vehicles. Certainly, does it mean more incentives for buying electric cars? What are the other things that are going to happen? But I think that, I think a big part of the recovery is going to be focused on actual recovery.
Thank you for that. So Dan Fried, who's worked in the State Department, as you know, Dan, for many years, actually another neighbor of ours as well, and has worked on sanctions issues as well for many years. Former ambassador to Poland. He has a good geopolitics question. If sanctions are not the way to deal with Nord Stream 2, and Dan feels they are not, how should we deal with it? And where do you think that stands right now?
Well, I think it's interesting. I wish we could bring Dan in to ask him what he thinks are the alternatives to sanctions, because he's about as knowledgeable as anybody about the practice of sanctions, what they achieve and what their limits are. And I probably can't bring him in to say, but, I mean, it looked like Nord Stream 2, one way or the other, would go ahead, and then came the poisoning of Navalny. And how does that change the, basically attitudes in Germany to it? And I gather that in Moscow, they've just seized Navalny's apartment, that it's kind of, doesn't stop. The thing that seems to me about Nord Stream 2 is that there's this view that if it's not built, Russian gas won't go to Europe. Well, Russian gas will go to Europe. It'll just go to Europe different ways. Obviously, some more through Ukraine. The other thing that's happening is that Russia is now going to become a big exporter of LNG. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that maybe Russian LNG will be competing with Russian pipeline gas. So I have I go back, Fred, and this goes back to when you were running the Wall Street Journal in Europe. For 70 years, the U.S. has sought to periodically prevent Russian gas and oil exports to Europe and use sanctions. But I think of that remark that George Shultz, then Secretary of State, made in the 1980s gas thing, which is well worth going back and looking at. He said sanctions are a wasting asset, and that there'll be responses elsewhere. So I'm not sure, whether just a policy mainly based on sanctions is going to achieve whatever the objective is in other things such as election interference and so forth. But, so whether Nord Stream 2 goes ahead or not, Russian gas is going to come to Europe. It's about 35% of Europe's gas and 10% of its total energy.
Where are you looking, and how are you looking at China as an emitter going forward in this climate world? Vinette Sharma asks a question. China is going in for huge infrastructure projects and Belt and Road Initiative, and most of them are using massive carbon emitting solutions like mining, coal, and fossil fuels. So is that going to be an impediment to green carbon in the future?
Well, China has just, Xi at the UN this week announced that China intends to be net zero carbon by 2060. Energy looms very large in that economy in terms of growth. It's, I think, going back to what we said before, it's an important part of its overall sort of strategic thinking. And half the wind in the world, half the solar in the world is in China, but they're also building 3 new coal-fired plants a month. So it's a mixed picture. And I think what you say, a lot of the things they do are energy intensive. And that raises a question, Fred, that people maybe don't think about. One of the things that we at IHS Markit are looking at is what we call the new supply chains for net zero carbon. And the new supply chains for net zero carbon require carbon. They require diesel to operate shovels and moving. So there's a lot of mining. And I make the remark in the book that maybe, we talk about big oil, maybe in 10 years, we'll be talking about this other industry called big shovels, because there's going to be a lot of shoveling and a lot of transportation of minerals. And going back to Majid's question, I think people will be looking at the ESG aspects of the supply chains for net zero carbon too, for what the carbon impact is and the other environmental impacts.
Fascinating. Lots of interesting questions. It's interesting how much when we talk about the oil and gas world, how rarely we talk about Venezuela any longer. And David Yellen asked a really interesting question about Venezuela, and essentially, sharing your views on the recovery of Venezuela, and also given the oil and gas sector, what kind of role is this going to play in the country going forward?
I mean, Venezuela, here's a country that actually has the world's largest oil reserves. They're not cheap to produce, the largest. And it's sort of, you could almost see it producing almost zero oil. It produces a lot less oil than the state of North Dakota. And what the Chavez Maduro regime has done to that country is awful. There are, I think, more refugees from Venezuela than there are from Syria that have, as a result of just the devastation of the country. And as long as that clique is in power, recovery isn't in sight. It's imposing horrible conditions on its people. For this dream of what Chavez called socialism for the 21st century, which turned out to be a true human disaster and tragedy of the 21st century.
So I think we did figure out that Dan can come on. So Dan Fried, can you come on the camera, and were you satisfied with Dan Yergin's answer, or would you like to add something to that?
I'm always satisfied with Dan Yergin's answers. The question on Nord Stream 2 is whether the Germans and the Europeans are so angry at Putin over the Navalny attempted murder that they're willing to swallow hard and pull the plug on Nord Stream 2. I've never liked Nord Stream 2, and I hope they kill it. I don't think sanctions are the right way to go. If they don't kill it, we, the Germans, the Poles, the EU, need to think of ways to mitigate the strategic dangers of Nord Stream 2. And I think there are ways other than sanctions. Anyway,
Oh, I see where you're going. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Dan, I think it's happened more than people know, because after the Ukrainian gas crisis of 2006, 2009, Europe moved to make its pipeline system much more flexible so they can move gas easily. The other thing is LNG. And, I talk in the book about Putin's dislike of US shale. One reason is because of LNG. And the Europeans now have flexibility that they didn't have. They have diversity of choices, so that if there was leverage in the past, subject to much argument, it's not there now, because, when the Lithuanians put in their LNG receiving terminal, the energy minister said, gas has been depoliticizing. And the other thing he noticed is that the price of Russian gas suddenly went down. So I think that I understand what you're saying is the mitigating factors that offset it, that make it less of a strategic issue than it would have been, 10 or 12 years ago. So thank you, Dan. Thanks for popping in.
Thank you for that, Dan. So a couple of questions on related to China. Ken Silverstein is asking, has Trump forced China to form this close relationship with Russia? How would a Biden presidency force any realignment? And then just distantly related to this, we haven't talked about Australia. Bruce Gellerman's asked a number of good questions here, but it would be interesting to hear about Australia's floating LNG platform and tense China relationship.
Right. Well, to take the first part, Fred, just before we went on, I turned to page 172 in the book and read all the kind of statements of previous presidents about China, a constructive relationship with a changing China, engagement, China becoming part of a rules-based international order. And I call all of that the WTO consensus. And that WTO consensus is, changed. All you have to do is go to the Atlantic Council website and watch your discussion with Secretary Pompeo. We've gone from that kind of view of interdependence to one on both sides of strategic competition, of great power rivalry, language we haven't heard for a long time. So I think that, that relationship, that is the most important relationship, and it's the most complex. The difference between that and the Soviet-American Cold War, Soviet-American had nuclear weapons. Here, these two economies are so tightly connected and connected in the world economy. So I think this is a really, the biggest, most complex question to deal with for U.S. foreign policy. How different would a Biden team be? I think there are a lot of landmines, basically, that would have to be crossed over. And I think, Fred, and I think you will have observed, and the Atlantic Council knows, that although there are a few things that unite Democrats and Republicans in Washington, one is this view that China is a strategic rival and a competitor. And so, but I think maybe there would be less drama in the policies. But I think that there's plenty of risk there, particularly in the South China Sea and obviously around Taiwan and so forth, where kind of a breakdown in the communication and the strategic mistrust between both sides and a lot of things that have happened, Hong Kong and a lot of other things. So I think this is really a difficult problem. And you point to Australia, that's kind of, that's a really classic case of it. Because on the one hand, China is a really important market for Australia. On the other hand, relationships have, and a lot of the investment in big $50-60 billion investment in an LNG project with the idea that China is a major market for it. On the other hand, from a strategic point of view, certainly the relationships between China and Australia have become quite taut and indeed fraught. And so I think for a lot of countries, how to navigate first between the U.S. and China right now. You mentioned you've done a dialogue with the president of Colombia, and he's talked about the importance of the strategic relationship with the United States, but China is a really big market. So to have this kind of competition when things are so connected economically and having the politics and the economics at odds with each other is a difficult problem, whether it's for the United States or whether it's for Australia.
A decoupling from a country that has $1 trillion of our debt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, exactly. We're going to decouple. Well, that's a really good point, Fred. You got to. It's a little more complicated than that. You can't just slam the door and say we're out of here. And and I think the other side is a lot of people would be surprised. A lot of Americans would be surprised to know that in their pension plans and their 401ks are Chinese equities, and some of the growth that's giving them their return has to do with Chinese stocks.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ways you could lead this new map.
Right.
So one thing that's wonderful, Dan, is we're getting questions from all around the world, and now from Brazil. So Eduardo Viola from Brazil wants to know what the role of Brazil in the new energy map is. You did mention Colombia as well. So perhaps you could take also a swipe at Latin America. I remember that at one point, one thought there was going to be great shale gas reserves there in Argentina.
Well, Argentina does have shale gas reserves.
Yeah.
It take money and time to develop. Colombia has it. They would like to develop it. Brazil has this fantastic offshore they're called the pre-salt. And, in fact, Brazil is a major producer of oil. Very significant. It also has biofuels. So it's definitely a player in the picture, a major non-OPEC country. And as so often happens, people didn't think the oil was there, and then it turned out to be there. And that's been good for Brazil. And what Brazil has been able to do is be realistic and have international companies come in as partners and bring their technology and take the risk to develop the resources. And that's accelerated. Before, it had a much more protectionist policy and saddled Petrobras, the state company, with debts that just was a very difficult problem for it. Obviously, Brazil, like everybody else, is caught up right now in the coronavirus and all the difficulties that's imposed on the society.
We're getting in the last few minutes, and I'm not going to get to all these wonderful questions, but there are a number of questions around nuclear. So Andrew Kadak is talking about as scale is a big issue in the transition. Why aren't more countries pushing new nuclear plants which are able to meet the scale needed? And I think if you look at Saudi, if you look at China, maybe they are, but maybe you can deal with that. The other is more specific, and it's from a longtime board member of the Atlantic Council, Ron Freeman, who is also one of the top people at the EBRD, asking about Russian tokamak, the fission-based nuclear power, any signs of real usable progress there. So nuclear in general as a scalable solution in the energy transition, and then this specific question about fission-based Russian.
I'm afraid on Ron's question, I'm going to have to claim ignorance. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that there are lots and lots of kind of renewed interest in nuclear, and I think we're going to see, just a bill passed through the U.S. Congress to provide $4 billion for sort of next generation nuclear. I believe I have that right. On the larger question, Germany, a country you know very well, decided after Fukushima, we're shutting down our nuclear. In that same period that they've shut down their entire nuclear, or shutting down their entire nuclear capacity, China has added much more nuclear capacity. So I think in developing countries, in Abu Dhabi, where you have, the Atlantic Council has a very important program. They have 4 reactors. So you do see it, and you do see Russia and China being kind of leaders in selling nuclear power technology into emerging markets. The US still gets about 20% of our electricity from nuclear, but these plants, their life needs to be renewed, and also some of them are having trouble competing with cheap natural gas, cheap shale gas in the marketplace. So, but if you say 20%, of zero carbon from nuclear, you see that in the kind of scenarios that Paula was raising before, nuclear has to play a role in order to achieve those objectives.
So let me end where you end your wonderful book. And again, in the chat, you'll see where you can buy it. You can link there to Politics and Prose. And it's called The Disrupted Future. And it's a disturbing future as you outline it. You talk about where does the new map of energy and geopolitics lead. You talk about how we had the collapse of Soviet communism, transformation of China, India's move to open its economy, together bringing 2.5 billion people in the world economy, creating connections and opportunities that were not imagined previously. And then you go into a second paragraph after describing that, saying, but the momentum is now in reverse. And you talk about going from a more collaborative to a less collaborative world, struggles over climate for sure, but you also talk about the potential or the danger of a clash of nations. Why do you end there, and how concerned are you about this disrupted future?
Well, first, let me say, despite all that litany that you have, I'm an optimistic person and optimistic by nature. But I think it was just standing back saying, look at all the surprises. Not all of them are negative. I mean, what's happened with digitalization, with technology, there are many that are positive as well as negative, but you do see these big surprises that come and change it. And of course, now the latest is the coronavirus, and by most people not anticipated. And I think it shows the kind of globalization doesn't go away for sure. Look at this conference we're having, but it is a more fragmented system. Deng Xiaoping talked about one country, 2 systems about Hong Kong, now overtaken by events. Are we going to have one world, 2 systems there? Kind of fragmentation. Supply chains, people just took them for granted as, well, these were economic decisions and you had people who managed supply chains. Now we see there's a geopolitical context to supply chains too. And the inability to have a collaborative world response to this virus is sadly a very deeply painful and troubling symptom of a kind of breakdown of collaboration when you need it. So, again and again, and Fred, you write as a historian too, that you look at even the recent past and you see so many things that people didn't anticipate, the 2008 financial crisis. But so all of those things, and to be prepared for and be resilient, it's better to have a more collaborative international order because it enables you to deal with the big problems. But I do end on that note that being a realist, I hope that, 2 things that we can count on. Climate is going to be a big central question. And unfortunately, we are seeing a kind of clash of nations that you would not have anticipated 5 or 6 years ago. And navigating our way through it, being realistic about it, is going to be a very important aspect of statecraft in the years ahead.
And thank you for closing with that, because that is the purpose of the Atlantic Council. We really want to advance this collaborative future. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for Atlantic Council Front Page, and particularly to Dan Yergin, a real dear friend and one of a brilliant Pulitzer Prize winning author and writer, and a person who can really put pieces together around the world and make sense of them in a really unique way. I want to thank our team who put this together: Lauren Holland, Jasper Gilardi, David Yellen, Randy Bell, of course, Vicente Garcia, Jackson Styron, Roger Morales, and excellent interns Mercedes Sapupo and Frank Wiley. If it's Willie, Frank, forgive me if I got the pronunciation right. We look forward to seeing you at our next Atlantic Council front page episode featuring Mayor Pete Buttigieg next Wednesday, September 30th at 10 a.m. Dan, thank you so much, and buy the book. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Fred, and thank you, Atlantic Council. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Bye-bye.